Mr. President, members, members of the Security Council, today's briefing is devoted to the Secretary General's quarterly report on the implementation of the Resolution 2334. Before turning to the report, allow me a few remarks. At the outset, I reiterate the Secretary General condemnation of Sunday's heinous terror attack on Jewish families gathered to celebrate Hanukkah in Sydney, Australia. I share in the grief of the Jewish community and stand with Jewish families worldwide as they mark the festival of Hanukkah, which celebrate light vanquishing darkness. Mr. President, turning to the situation in Gaza, the ceasefire remains fragile, as we have seen with continued attacks and strikes in Gaza. I welcome the ongoing efforts by the mediators to avert further escalation, support implementation of the current commitments, including the recovery and return of the last Israeli hostage, and to advance discussions on the next phase and implementation of the comprehensive Gaza in line with the UN Security Resolution 2803. The UN is doing its part to support the ceasefire and meet the staggering needs of the population. The UN's winterization efforts are underway, distributing tents, blankets, and other essential supplies, reaching people where they are. But conditions remain dire, and the risk of hypothermia is increasing with the onset of the winter weather. Tragically, the first hypothermia-related death, a 2-week-old newborn boy from Khan Yunis, was confirmed. Preserving and expanding of space for humanitarian partners, including through the community. I welcome the partial reopening of the Allenby King Hussein Bridge crossing for the transfer of aid to Gaza following a deadly attack on Israeli soldiers there in September. However, supplies through this route are currently capped at low levels. Large quantities of aid are prepositioned in warehouses in Jordan, awaiting full resumption. I urge the authorities of Israel to enable the timely and at-scale movement of life-saving assistance through the independent Jordan Coordinating Constitution. Mr. President, in concerning development on 8 December, Israeli authorities forcibly entered the UNRWA compound in East Jerusalem, seizing property and replacing the UN flag with Israeli flag. The Secretary General strongly condemned these actions and emphasized that the compound remains United Nations premises and is inviolable and immune from any other form of interference. On 11 December, Israeli cabinet decided to approve or regularize 19 settlements in the occupied West Bank. This includes the settlements of Ghanim and Kadim in the northern West Bank, which has been evacuated by Israel in 2005. Mr. President, I will now turn to highlighting some of the Secretary General's observation on the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2334 of the year 2016 during the reporting period. I welcome the ceasefire in Gaza based on US President's plan to end the Gaza conflict and through the tireless mediation efforts of Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and the United States. The ceasefire offers a critical opportunity to halt the bloodshed and improve the humanitarian situation. I urge Israel and Hamas to fully implement the ceasefire, exercise maximum restraint, and adhere to international law, including relevant UN resolutions. The ceasefire must be consolidated to enable recovery and reconstruction in Gaza. The United Nations stands ready. I welcome the release of all living hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, and I am relieved that families are being reunited after long periods of anguish. I call for the immediate return of the remains of the last deceased hostage. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, has been indispensable in I reiterate the protection of including sexual violence and by the withholding of some violence. I unequivocally condemn the killing and injury of civilians in Gaza, including children and women. While the ceasefire has largely held, periodic Israeli military strikes continue, causing significant civilian casualties and extensive damages to homes and infrastructure. Armed Palestinian attacks against Israeli soldiers have also continued. Gunfire and shelling near withdrawal lines and attacks on civilians attempting to return home or access land have resulted in further loss of life. Such incidents must immediately cease. I am deeply concerned by the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, where infrastructure damage is catastrophic. While hunger has improved due to increased aid and commercial foods, people remain out of reach for most of the population, alongside with severe shortages of clean water, medical care, and shelter. Humanitarian access remains restricted, with aid convoys facing logistical and security obstacles. I call on all parties to respect humanitarian law and allow the full, unimpeded entry of humanitarian assistance. I condemn relentless Israeli settlement expansions in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which fuels tensions, impedes Palestinian land access, and threatens the viability of the contiguous and sovereign Palestinian state. Expanding or settlement, including outposts, coincides with rising settler attacks, further entrenching the unlawful occupation and violating international law, undermining Palestinian self-determination. All Israeli settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and related infrastructure have no legal validity and violate international law and UN resolutions. In 2025, settlement advancement reached its highest point since UN began tracking in 2017. I urge Israel to abide by its obligation under international law, recalling the International Court of Justice opinion of 19 July 2024, which obliges Israel to cease all settlement activities, evacuate settlers, and end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory promptly. Escalating violence and tensions in the West Bank are alarming. Israeli security operations in the Northwest Bank caused high fatalities, population displacement, and large-scale destruction, especially in refugee camps. Continued Israeli security presence in camps contravenes obligations to end the unlawful occupation. I condemn rising settler violence across the West Bank, which intensified during the olive harvest. Attacks have become more frequent and violent, often with the presence or support of Israeli security forces. Palestinian farmers have faced assault, harassment, and obstruction from their lands. Olive trees are uprooted or burned, and the entire harvest destroyed. These attacks deprive families of vital livelihoods and risk forcible displacement. Israeli authorities must prevent attacks, hold perpetrators accountable, and ensure the safe access for farmers. I condemn continued armed attacks by Palestinians against Israelis. All violence against civilians, including terror, must cease immediately, with perpetrators held accountable. I remain concerned about large numbers of Palestinians, including children, detained by Israel since 7 October 2023, including administrative detention without charge or trial. Reports of torture, ill treatment, including sexual violence, and deaths in custody are deeply concerning. Israel must use detention as a last resort for the shortest period, prevent ill treatment, and end administrative detention of children. I'm appalled by officials glorifying violence and engaging in dangerous provocations, incitement, and inflammatory language. Incitement to violence must stop immediately. I am deeply concerned by the Palestinian authorities' prolonged fiscal crisis, further destabilizing the economy, undermining trust, exacerbating insecurity, and eroding social order. Israeli authorities must seek unilateral economic measures that threaten peace and stability. I remain committed to supporting Palestinians and Israel, supporting the conflict in line with international law, UN resolution, and bilateral agreements, pursuing a two-state vision, Israel and a fully independent, democratic, contiguous, viable, sovereign Palestinian state, including Gaza, living side by side in peace and security, based on pre-1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Al-Akbarov for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. France condemned in the strongest terms the horrific anti-Semitic terrorist attack that has affected Australia. Nothing can justify such violence, and we have presented our condolences to the victims, to their families, and to the Australian people. Mr. President, grateful to the Deputy Special Coordinator, Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov, for his briefing. A month ago, the Council adopted Resolution 2803, aimed at implementing the peace plan for Gaza presented by President Trump. This resolution endorsed the progress obtained over the past few months, and in particular supporting the efforts of the U.S., Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey. The ceasefire, the release of hostages, and resumption still insufficient of humanitarian assistance. This is a first step which must be fully consolidated. The ceasefire must be fully respected by the parties, and the massive delivery of humanitarian aid must be ensured throughout Gaza by the United Nations and their partners. The last body of a hostage must be returned. It's also urgent to allow for the deployment of the International Stabilization Force, the disarmament of Hamas, and withdrawal of Israeli forces. In parallel, the establishment of a transition government in Gaza must lead to a return of a reformed Palestinian Authority, and France intends to fully contribute to these efforts. At the same time, the situation in the West Bank and the East Bank and the East Jerusalem, is deteriorating severely, marked by an alarming intensification of violence. France would like to recall that the future of Gaza and of the West Bank are interconnected. Violence in the West Bank compromises prospects for lasting peace and security for Palestinians and for Israelis. The success of the peace plan for Gaza and regional stability. Mr. President, I'd like to insist on 5 very worrisome developments currently underway in the West Bank. First of all, Israeli military operations are intensifying, with the launch of a major operation in the north, leading to the forced displacement of populations, in particular in refugee camps, and violations of human rights. The summary execution of 2 unarmed Palestinians by Israeli border guards in Jenin is a tragic illustration of this violence. This incident must be fully investigated. Secondly, a massive increase of violence by settlers against Palestinian civilians has sowed terror and compromised the stability of the West Bank, as well as prospects for global comprehensive peace and security. France calls Israel to protect the Palestinian population and to punish the perpetrators of the violence. Thirdly, the recent approval by the Israeli government of 19 new outposts and the settler project E1 constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and a blow to the two-state solution. We reiterate our condemnation of the expansion of settlements and our opposition to any form of annexation of the West Bank, whether it's partial, total, or de facto. Fourthly, the persistent threats against the work of UNRWA are unacceptable, in particular the raid of its facilities in East Jerusalem in violation of the status of UN facilities. Any additional hindrance to the action of UNRWA, which plays a central role for the Palestinian population, would go against the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of the 22nd of October of 2025. We call on Israel to lift all obstacles to humanitarian aid and to cooperate with UN agencies. Conformity with this advisory opinion, including by opening all the crossing points and by ceasing to refuse in an arbitrary way the delivery of essential goods for the survival of the population delivered by the UN. Fifthly, the persistent refusal by the Israeli government to restore to the Palestinian Authority its tax receipts and renew the system of banking corresponding banks is unjustifiable. The weakening of the Palestinian Authority compromised its ability to implement reforms and assume its responsibilities in Gaza as anticipated by Resolution 2803. Its financial collapse would be a serious threat to regional stability and to the security of Israel. Mr. President, to conclude, France reaffirms its commitment to the two-state solution with a state of Palestine living in peace and security side by side with Israel. This is the only credible horizon for peace and security for everyone in the region, in conformity with the New York Declaration adopted in September by a very broad majority in the General Assembly. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Deputy Special Coordinator Al-Akbarov for his briefing on the implementation of Resolution 2334. This resolution is a clear message of law and responsibility. It affirmed that the Israeli actions in the occupied Palestinian Authority constitute violation of international humanitarian law. Yet, what has followed is not compliance, but defiance, an open disregard not only for international law, but for the authority of this council itself. President, this is the last meeting on the question of Palestine in which my delegation, the delegation of Algeria, participates as an elected member of this council. One might therefore ask, is it still worth repeating what is already written, what is already documented? And should I say, what has been ignored? The Secretary General has spoken. His report has spoken. The fact on the ground has spoken clearly, accurately, relentlessly. In the West Bank, settlements have reached their highest recorded level. Legislative steps have been taken to extend Israeli occupation law to settlements. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been forcibly displaced. More than 1,000 military operations have resulted in the detention of over 860 Palestinians, among them at least 50 children. 50 children. Settlers' terrorism has become a daily occurrence, averaging 5 incidents a day throughout this year. Just yesterday, Israeli forces demolished 2 more buildings in Ramallah and in East Jerusalem. Thus, more than 1,000 demolitions have been carried out since October 2023. And in the few next days, 100 homes, Palestinian homes, are planned to be demolished. This is not an anomaly. It is not a deviation. It is the routine of occupation. An occupation administered with precision and sustained by silence, our silence. And so we must ask, Mr. President, what has this Council done to ensure the implementation of its own resolutions? The answer does not require debate. It requires honesty, simply honesty. This Council did nothing. Nothing. Had such violations unfolded elsewhere, this chamber would have moved swiftly. Sanctions imposed, accountability mechanism activated, perpetrators named and restrained. Here, however, the opposite has occurred. Protection, yes, protection instead of pressure. Reward instead of restraint. It is not this climate of immunity, of impunity, that has emboldened the Israeli occupying authorities to assault. Just last week, the headquarters of UNRWA, an act Algeria condemns strongly. UN premises are inviolable under international law. This is not a subject of interpretation. It is an obligation. Mr. President, I had also intended to speak of Gaza. But Gaza no longer needs description. Gaza needs protection. Despite the ceasefire endorsed by Resolution 2803, catastrophe persists. As we have seen in Lebanon and Syria, Israeli occupying forces continue to act, continue to bomb, as though ceasefire arrangement bind everyone except themselves. Since the ceasefire entered into effect, airstrikes have continued across the Strip, killing at least 356 Palestinians, including women, and at least 50 children. Sorry, every life count, 58 children, and injuring more than 1,000 others. Since the ceasefire entered into effect, nearly 600 violations were recorded. This is not a ceasefire. the ceasefire violated daily ceases to exist. It becomes merely the management of violence. The normalization of death. Israel's genocidal war on Gaza continue unabated. And we therefore call upon the guarantors of the ceasefire. Yes, the guarantors of the ceasefire, to uphold their responsibility, to have the courage to uphold their responsibilities, not rhetorically, but practically, not selectively, but fully, to ensure that the Israeli occupying power complies with its commitment in good faith, without exception and without delay. Mr. President, 2 years have passed. Yet, for the Palestinian people, they have amounted to an entire age, a period marked by a brutal aggression by the Israeli occupying forces. An aggression directed to existence itself in an attempt to annihilate, yes, annihilate a people, to uproot them from their land and resurrect the tragedies of the Nakba with all the pain, the displacement, and deprivation it carries. During this period, the price paid in Palestinian blood has been without precedent in the Middle East. In Gaza alone, more than 70,000 people have been killed and over 170,000 wounded. These are figures that bear witness to the scale of the tragedy, a tragedy that targeted children and women, journalists and humanitarian workers, doctors and relief personnel. A tragedy from which even United Nations staff were not spared. It is among the darkest chapters humanity has known in this century. It is among the greatest tests of the conscience of humankind. Confronted with the enormity of this suffering and the magnitude of the catastrophe, Algeria, throughout its membership in this council, sought to stand by its Palestinian brothers and sisters, sought to spare no efforts to lift the injustice, yes, the injustice inflicted upon them. Yet it becomes it became painfully clear that the Israeli occupation enjoys impunity within this Council. This is a moment when the very legitimacy of the international system has come under question, and its effectiveness under doubt. Gaza has led bare, as has Palestinian as a whole, the reality of an international order that no longer recognizes anything but force. A message echoing across the world that the logic of power has become the principal driver of international relations at the expense of law, of justice, and the principles upon which this organization, the United Nations, was founded. In closing, Mr. President, as Algeria concludes its term in the Security Council, it reiterates again and again, as affirmed by the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, and I quote, "Algeria will remain faithful to its commitment in support of our brothers and sisters in occupied Palestine. Algeria will spare no effort in defending their legitimate rights until full sovereignty is restored and a free, independent state of Palestine is established." I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to the Deputy Special Coordinator of the United Nations for the Middle East peace process, Ramiz Alakbarov, for the detailed briefing on the situation on the occupied Palestinian territory in the context of the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. It is with deep regret that we are compelled, following the briefer, to observe the fact that the long-anticipated ceasefire in Gaza did not usher in alleviation of the plight of the residents of the West Bank, where, in addition to frequent military raids, the Israelis have launched a military operation in Tubas and Jenin. Since late September in the West Bank of Jordan River, including East Jerusalem, Israeli security forces and armed settlers have killed more than 40 Palestinians. More than 800 were wounded. And in October, the settlers carried out more than 260 attacks, which broke the record since 2006. These attacks became a part of a systematic campaign not just to intimidate local residents, but also to strip them of means of existence. The settler raids targeting olive harvests, together with the drought and unlimited access of farmers and agricultural workers to their lands, have already resulted in the lowest harvests since 2025, and this is the main source of revenue for the residents of the West Bank. The plans for the construction of new Israeli settlements on the West Bank are moving apace at a record tempo. In 2024, there were 26,170 housing units approved for erection, and in 2025, that number nearly doubled, reaching 47,390 units. In parallel, an illusion is being established of a legal justification for this illegal expansion. On the 12th of December, the Israeli Israeli Ministerial Cabinet decided to legalize the 19 settlements on the West Bank to give them a legal status. The Israeli leadership also clings to the idea of the de facto annexation of the West Bank of the Jordan River. In the Knesset, a bill is under consideration to repeal the prohibition on Jews gaining access to land in this part of the OPT. Against this backdrop, there's an ongoing practice of demolition of Palestinian units under the pretext of an absence of Israeli authorities granting permission, which is virtually impossible to secure. Since late September, 152 Palestinian housing units were demolished, and 24 of them, incidentally, had to be destroyed by the Palestinians themselves in order to avoid very high fines. This grotesque state of affairs reflects the true approach to the Palestinian people on the part of, according to what the U.S. colleagues assert, is the only democracy in the Middle East. I also wish to draw attention to the reprehensible raid of Israel targeting the UNRWA facilities in East Jerusalem on the 8th of October. Such acts fly in the face of the United Nations Convention on Privileges and Immunities. We also wish to recall the advisory opinion of the ICJ dating 22 October 2025. Relating to Israel's obligation regarding the presence and activities of the United Nations, other international organizations, and third states on the OPT. A General Assembly resolution was adopted on 12 December in support of that. We support the ongoing interrupted work of the UNRWA, which is the only source to which there's no alternative for comprehensive assistance to the Palestinians, both on the OPT and neighboring Arab lands. The large-scale, deliberate destruction of UNRWA facilities and the death of its staff must not remain unpunished. Mr. President, speaking of Gaza, there's a need to recognize that as part of the implementation of Donald Trump's plan, it has been possible to stem the large-scale bloodletting and hunger in the Strip. However, a lasting ceasefire has not been achieved. Since the 10th of October, Israel rained approximately 800 strikes down on Gaza, as a result of which at least 386 people died. The Israeli side continues to position significant obstacles to delivery of humanitarian assistance. The flow of cargo cleared for import only covers 35% of the needs, and entire categories of objects are arbitrarily being prohibited under the pretext of their being dual use in nature. Under these circumstances, the responsibility for the implementation of the provisions of the Comprehensive Peace Plan on Gaza lies with the United States and those states who publicly supported the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2803. We trust that the future transitional structures in the enclave will be formulated while taking into account the views of Ramallah, and the handover of authority to the PNA in the sector will take place in the foreseeable future. We believe that matters related to the future of Gaza need to be considered as being part and parcel of the main part of the OPT. A key role in Donald Trump's plan is set out for the ISF. 1 month after the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2803, it remains unclear which states are willing to join this mission. And we do not think this is not a coincidence. It is one matter to deploy specialists for a peacekeeping operation who will deal with ceasefire monitoring, deconfliction, and facilitating the restoration of the Palestinian security forces. It is another matter to have units whose goal is to attempt through force to compel the Palestinian fighters to relinquish weapons. This objective is liable to transform the ISF into a party to the conflict, with all of the attendant consequences, which multiply security risks for the foreign contingents deployed there. One cannot expect the ISF to achieve the impossible. We urge mediators to focus on seeking launch comprehensive negotiations to resolve the issue of disarmament of Palestinian groups and withdrawal of Israeli units from Gaza. The whole world has witnessed the horrors of a military attempts at military solution over the past 2 years. The time is ripe for real diplomacy on the ground, real diplomacy which has nothing to do with loud proclamations, real diplomacy which requires compromise and calm. Russia had and continues to embrace a principled position on Palestinian-Israeli settlement. Over the course of the wave of the recent outbreak of conflict and escalation, we called for immediate, unconditional, comprehensive ceasefire with the delivery of safe and unimpeded immediate humanitarian assistance in accordance with the well-known guiding principles. We call for the launch of the peace process on a universally recognized international legal basis, including a two-state solution which will usher in the creation of an independent, viable state of Palestine within the 1967 borders, with the capital in East Jerusalem, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. At the same time, we consistently advocate uncompromising efforts to combat terrorism and extremism in all of their forms and their manifestations. For this reason, we vehemently condemned the barbaric extremist attack targeting Sydney during the commemorations of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah on the 14th of December, as a result of which innocent civilians, including a Russian compatriot, died. We extend our deepest condolences to the families of the dead, and we wish a speedy recovery to those who have been injured. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I wish to begin by expressing our condolences to the victims of the mass shooting that struck Sydney, Australia, and expressing our solidarity with the bereft families and those injured. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Mr. Alakbarov for his briefing. When the Middle East is in turmoil, the world cannot be at peace. The Palestinian question remains at the very heart of the challenges in the Middle East. The latest outbreak of the Gaza conflict has brought unimaginable suffering to both Palestinian and Israeli civilians and triggered severe spillover effects across the Middle East. While the first phase ceasefire agreement in Gaza has been reached, the prospect of peace remains distant. The historical injustices endured by the Palestinian people persist. The Palestinian question should never be relegated to the margins. The international community must further build consensus and take more proactive actions to advance a political solution. First, violent conflict must not resume. A comprehensive and lasting ceasefire in Gaza must be secured. Over the past 2 months, frequent violations of the ceasefire agreement in Gaza have resulted in the death of over 300 civilians. Reaching a ceasefire agreement must entail the complete cessation of all hostilities, not merely a downgrade from intense conflict to a low-intensity attacks. Any reckless violation of the agreement could jeopardize and ultimately collapse the tenuous ceasefire. China calls on all parties, Israel in particular, to immediately fulfill their commitments under the ceasefire agreement, refrain from actions that could escalate tensions, and work toward achieving a genuine, comprehensive, and lasting ceasefire. Relevant mediating parties should take concrete steps to ensure the implementation of the ceasefire agreement. Second, the suffering of civilians must not continue. Urgent action is needed to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Winter storms have brought torrential rains, inundating numerous temporary camps and placing hundreds of thousands of displaced people under severe threat. Israel's continued restrictions on access to essential supplies are impeding the efforts of UNRWA and other humanitarian agencies to deliver critical assistance. Last week, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly adopted a resolution supporting the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which clearly affirms Israel's obligations as the occupying power to ensure humanitarian supplies to Gaza and to cooperate with UNRWA and other relevant agencies. China urges Israel to earnestly fulfill its obligations under international law, open all border crossings, lift access restrictions on humanitarian supplies, and support the work of the UN and other aid agencies. Third, the situation in the West Bank must not be overlooked. Unilateral actions in violation of international law must cease immediately. The occupying power continues to advance settlement policies, demolish Palestinian homes, condone settler violence resulting in massive civilian casualties and displacement. Settlement activities violate international law and Council Resolution 2334, shrinking Palestinian living space and eroding the foundations of the two-state solution. We call on Israel to immediately cease all settlement activities, curb settler violence, and refrain from undermining the governance foundations of the Palestinian Authority. This includes the prompt return of withheld tax revenues and the removal of restrictions imposed on the Palestinian economy. Fourth, justice and fairness must prevail. The two-state solution must be implemented without delay. Implementing the two-state solution, establishing an independent state of Palestine, is the only viable path to resolving the Palestinian question. Any arrangements concerning Gaza's future must be guided by the principle of Palestinians governing Palestine. Any attempt to alter Gaza's territorial or demographic composition must be firmly rejected. 1 month has passed since the Security Council adopted Resolution 2803. The relevant country should act with a sense of responsibility toward the Palestinian people, the Security Council, and the international community by providing timely updates to the Council and ensuring the Council's close and sustained attention and effective engagement. The international community must redouble its efforts to advance the two-state solution, support the early establishment of an independent state of Palestine, and facilitate its full membership in the UN. President, China firmly supports the just cause of the Palestinian people in restoring their legitimate national rights. Recently, President Xi Jinping has on multiple occasions comprehensively articulated China's position and proposals for resolving the Palestinian question and announced that China will provide $100 million in assistance to Palestine to help alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and support its recovery and reconstruction. China will continue to work with the international community to promote a comprehensive and lasting ceasefire in Gaza, alleviate the humanitarian crisis, and make unremitting efforts towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the Palestinian question at an early date. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Deputy Special Coordinator Al-Akbarov. Before I begin, I want to pause to remember those killed and injured on Bondi Beach this weekend, celebrating Hanukkah. This attack must be called for what it is: anti-Semitic terrorism. President Trump and the U.S. government will continue to combat anti-Semitism wherever it occurs, including here at the United Nations. Last week, Ambassador Waltz traveled to Jordan and Israel, where he had the honor of spending time with the mother and father of Police Sergeant Ran Gavili, the last remaining hostage in Gaza. There, Ambassador Waltz learned of Ran's heroism. While off from work on medical leave, he saved dozens of lives before he was ultimately injured in a firefight and dragged to Gaza on the back of a motorbike. The world knows that Hamas and its affiliates knew the location of every hostage, and President Trump was clear. As part of the comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict, every hostage must come home. Ran's body must be returned to his parents and siblings now. We cannot move forward until he is home. Ambassador Waltz also had the opportunity to visit a warehouse run by the Jordan Hashemite Charity Organization, where aid procured with American taxpayer money sits in warehouses. Some of it is at risk of expiring. However, due to U.S. advocacy, humanitarian aid is transiting the Allenby crossing again, with World Food Program trucks passing through on December 10th. We will continue to work with our partners in Jordan and Israel to fully reopen the Jordan corridor for the more effective government-to-government route. This corridor is the most efficient and accountable route for providing much-needed aid to Gaza. The United States supports the need for clear security arrangements after a terrorist killed 2 Israelis on September 18th at the Allenby crossing. All parties must work to address these security issues so that the corridor can return to its prior level of operation. This council should also acknowledge that humanitarian aid has surged since the ceasefire began. The efforts of the United States and our partners are improving the humanitarian situation on the ground. Over 30,000 commercial and humanitarian trucks have entered Gaza, bringing food, shelter, and medicine, all thanks to the efforts of President Trump and the Civil Military Coordination Center, known as the CMCC. We continue to work with the UN and others so that supplies can reach those in need without diversion to terrorists or looters. With the USG and other donor support, the World Food Program is providing approximately 2 million hot meals daily within Gaza, and it is operating more than 200 bakeries. A successful vaccination campaign inoculated tens of thousands of children, protecting them from daily disease. Since October, the U.S. government obligated an additional $330 million to WFP and other NGOs to continue emergency food and shelter assistance. It also provides for field hospital support and to address water and sanitation needs. All of these improvements are the result of the hard work of the United States and our partners at the CMCC. We call on all in the Council today to contribute to our efforts with the CMCC and the International Stabilization Force. As Secretary Rubio stated, UNRWA is a subsidiary of Hamas. UNRWA operates under the absurd framework that treats Hamas like any other actor, and it rejects any reasonable standards for accountability or the vetting of its staff or partners. Colleagues, we have been clear. The United States opposes these quarterly briefings on UNSCR 2334, as they only distract from pressing threats to international peace and security. Resolution 2803, not 2334, charts the path towards a stable, safe, and prosperous Middle East. We are working with partners to stand up the International Stabilization Force and train fully vetted Palestinian police, not rehashing decades of failed policies. This council should recognize and end its outsized focus on an outdated resolution. The United States remains focused on keeping Israel secure and the Gaza and West Bank stable. President Trump has been perfectly clear that the United States expects the violence in the West Bank to end and that the United States will not allow the annexation of the West Bank. Perfunctory meetings like this one today are a distraction. The United States and its partners in the region will continue to focus on improving the situation on the ground, day in and day out. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Deputy Special Coordinator Alec Barra for his briefing. I would like from the outset to express Denmark's condemnation of the recent terrorist attacks in Sydney. We stand not only with Australia, but also with the entire Jewish community in rejecting all forms of terrorism and anti-Semitism. Mr. President, 9 years ago, this Council took a decisive step. In adopting Resolution 2334, the international community declared Israeli settlements a violation of international law and called for their immediate halt. It was an act of real solidarity in an effort to safeguard the two-state solution. Today, however, we face a situation of expanded settlements, intensified settler violence, and widespread displacement. Our failure to make real progress on this issue has long been deeply troubling. If we do not act decisively, it will soon be irreversible. The conflict in Gaza has rightly drawn the attention of the international community for more than 2 years, but support to Gaza must not come at the expense of our focus on the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Mr. President, let me highlight 4 critical points. First, all settlement expansions must be halted immediately and any attempt at de facto annexation prevented. Continued expansion of Israeli settlements, legalization of outposts, seizure of Palestinian land, and implementation of the E1 plan are threatening the territorial integrity of a future Palestinian state. Denmark strongly deplores all settler takeovers and demolitions, including in the Silwan neighborhood of East Jerusalem. We urge Israel to immediately halt these measures and recall the attempts to change the demographic composition of the occupied Palestinian territory to forcible transfers and deportations are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Denmark is also appalled by the forcible raid of UNRWA's premises in East Jerusalem on 8 December and remind Israel of its obligations to respect the inviolability of UN premises. As underlined by the ICJ, including in its most recent opinion, Israel is under an obligation to cooperate in good faith with the United Nations. Second, Mr. President, we must prioritize the protection of civilians. More than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since 7 October 2023. We are now hearing reports of an average of 5 settler attacks a day, the highest level in nearly 20 years. We call on Israel to ensure the protection of civilians in the West Bank and the wider occupied Palestinian territory in accordance with its obligations under international humanitarian law. Third, Mr. President, we must continue to support reform and revitalization of the Palestinian Authority and secure reunification of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, under their rule. While the Palestinian Authority is focusing on its reform efforts, resources are urgently needed. We once again call on Israel to immediately release all withheld tax revenues and to renew the relevant bank agreement on a long-term basis. We must prevent the development of parallel structures that might inhibit reunification of Palestinian self-determination. Inclusion of the Palestinian Authority in all matters relating to their territory is essential. Fourth, we welcome the Comprehensive Plan for Gaza, which was recently endorsed by Security Council Resolution 2803. Following the long-awaited ceasefire in Gaza, more aid is now coming in. However, we are still far from meeting the tremendous needs on the ground. We are concerned by the continuous restriction by Israel, including on dual-use items, and call for the opening of more border crossings, including Rafah, and continued access for international NGOs. NGOs play a crucial role in delivering humanitarian assistance throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. We are deeply concerned by Israeli registration requirements set to take effect on 31st December, which will limit NGOs' ability to operate in Gaza as well as the West Bank. We call on Israel to ensure the rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access in line with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, in closing, these demands are not new. They are rooted in resolutions passed by this Council, nor, regrettably, is the information in the sobering briefing we have received today. What must change is how we react. Denmark stands ready to work with all Council members to this end, to pave the way for a future of 2 states living side by side in peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Ramiz Alakbarov for his briefing on the Secretary General's report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. We note the Secretary General's observations, including continued non-compliance with key obligations, particularly ongoing settlement activity and the lack of steps to reverse negative trends on the ground. At the outset, Sierra Leone condemns the recent attack in Sydney, Australia, during the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. We express our sincere condolences to the families of the victim. Mr. President, at the outset of our tenure, We recall Sierra Leone's long-lasting engagement on this agenda item, including a first intervention in the Council in 1970 on the plight of the Palestinians and the need to pursue peace through conciliation and reconciliation. We also now recall a last statement in our first tenure in 1971, supporting Council action grounded in the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by conquest. Those principles remain relevant today.